Events happen that change our lives. Dealing with change is what we do. We discuss with industry professionals objective solutions to work through cherished items and family memories. When we go beyond the gavel, we provide tools and information to deal with these crisis times.
Good afternoon. I'm Shane Feely with Auction Solutions. I'm here today beyond the gavel with Doug Quinn with McGrath North. Today we're going to talk about bankruptcy. We want to know the types of bankruptcies and as much information as we can get today. Thank you, Doug, for coming out today.
Thank you for having me, Shane. Well, if you want to start with the fundamentals, people need to understand that there are different types of bankruptcy. People don't often know that, but there are various chapters of the bankruptcy code. There's Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which used to be called a straight bankruptcy, and what that involves is you as a debtor filing, and you're giving up all of your non-exempt assets to be liquidated by a trustee, a panel trustee, and you're given a discharge of your debt. And we can talk about how the process works, but that's a Chapter 7 or straight bankruptcy. The next most frequent chapter is Chapter 13. Back in the day when I first became a lawyer, they were called wage earner plans because only people that earned wages were eligible for Chapter 13. They changed that with the 1978 Bankruptcy Code, and then anybody with a regular source of income was eligible. But you have to have a source of income. It could be lots of different things, but as long as you got something that's generating income for you, whether it be a job or not, then you can file Chapter 13. And that generally involves filing a plan of reorganization that lasts from 3 to 5 years, where you pay back all of your debt. Some people are not eligible for Chapter 7. Back when Congress, a few years back, I think it was 2005, they amended the bill so that only people, anybody with consumer debts, primarily consumer debts, which is probably 95% of us, you cannot make more than the median income for your state. If you do, you're ineligible, and you have to file a Chapter 13 and dedicate your disposable income above your allowable expenses for a period of 3 to 5 years to pay your creditors.
Okay. So would a credit advisor help at that point? Or there
it could, yeah. There? Yeah, sometimes if you can address it outside of bankruptcy, it's going to be cheaper.
Sure.
Because there are fees that are paid, and you're going to have to hire an attorney in a bankruptcy. Yeah, I've seen people go, and I've actually helped some people outside of bankruptcy where they've got a manageable number of creditors, go to them and say, look, here's what we've got. Will you take 20% on the dollar, and we'll pay you, and they'll do it. The problem with that approach is if you have more than maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 creditors, it's like herding cats, because all it takes is 1 or 2 to say no, and then you can't go on down that road.
I see. I just happen to think about, they're always advertising, come see us if you have some credit issues. Right. So Chapter 7, and you kind of explained that, so let's go to 13.
Like I said, 13, you file, you have to dedicate, you're allowed certain monthly expenses, and it varies, they're basically IRS guidelines, but you're allowed so much for your cost of housing, depending on the number of dependents. You're allowed so much for food, so much for cleaning expenses, those kinds of things. But once above that budgeted amount, your disposable income above that has to be paid to the Chapter 13 trustee, and the Chapter 13 trustee, who is Kathleen Laughlin here, and Kathleen's been around for a long time, she then oversees payment of the creditors from those proceeds above your expenses.
I see. So that's a pretty important job, trying to, like you said, herd the cats.
Yes, it is.
With the Chapter 13. Now talk a little bit about Chapter 11.
Chapter 11 is where I do probably a good chunk of my work. Chapter 11 is generally thought of as a corporate reorganization. The big cases you see, we represented the buyer Stage Stores in the Gordman's bankruptcy.
Okay.
That was a large Chapter 11 that was filed here because Gordman's was based in Nebraska. Generally, they're tinkering with it now, but generally you were allowed to file either in the state of your incorporation or the state where you were, where your principal residence
resides.
Yes.
Sure.
So Gordman's filed here. We represented Stage Stores, who successfully bought most of the stores and is doing gangbusters business from what I hear. We also represented the debtor in the Shopco case. So those are the kind of, when you think about, those are big cases. Or years ago, Texaco, or
right.
Any, there's there's a number of retail companies right now that are in and out of bankruptcy. And just this week there's a bunch of dairy cases that have been filed. Borden's Dairy filed, which was a huge, milk and cheese company.
Absolutely.
So it's generally those big companies. But Chapter 11 isn't restricted to those companies. It can also be used by individuals. It's very difficult for individuals to do a Chapter 11, though, because there are some restrictions on, there's a thing called the absolute priority rule, which basically says you can't retain anything unless you pay everybody in full. And so it's a lot more difficult for individuals to pull that off. Sometimes you can negotiate it where a creditor will say, I'll waive that if you get me so much, but it's more difficult. So Chapter 11 is the other main kind of bankruptcy. There's also Chapter 9, which has become more common of late. Nebraska for years was a leader in Chapter 9s because we have these entities called sanitary improvement districts.
Right.
And a lot of those were formed to set up different neighborhood associations. They set them up to build a bunch of houses. Well, those things developments get into trouble sometimes. So Nebraska had quite a few of those and developed some case law. Then there was a case about 15 years ago where the Orange County, California filed. They got into financial difficulty, and that was a big entity. And then the most recent one, of course, has been Puerto Rico, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. So there are more Chapter 9s. They're still fairly rare, but you're starting to see more of those. There's a couple other kinds of bankruptcy, too, that are very rare. One is railroad bankruptcies, and that has its own chapter. And we haven't had many of those since the 60s. I was involved with one a number of years ago. And the other chapter that comes in sometimes is Chapter 15. And what that involves is the United States application of an insolvency proceeding from overseas. So if a company files for bankruptcy in Italy, for example, but they've got American operations, they may file a Chapter 15 here to have to implement their plan of reorganization that's developed overseas here with the United States assets.
So it's kind of a working together, more of a
Yes.
everybody's going the same direction.
Exactly.
So if I am doing too much shopping in my household and I'm not able to afford to pay my credit cards, and all of a sudden I get behind and I do this for quite a while, and I come to you, what is my first step that I need to do besides bring you all my bills?
I would send you what are called a copy of the schedules and statement of affairs. They are, we have some computer software that used to be done on printed forms. Now we print them off and have people pencil them in and get those ready before they meet us. And that's going to list all of your assets and liabilities. It's going to list, there's a lot of different categories of assets that you own, from securities to bank accounts to pets to, about anything. It's also going to list all of your debts, and it's going to give your bankruptcy professional a way to analyze what the best way to go for you is.
I see.
But let's walk through the process. Let's assume that I tell you that because your debts you're below the median income, you're eligible for a Chapter 7. Well, we would get those papers put together. We would file that with the United States Bankruptcy Court, and the next step would be what's called your first meeting of creditors. Those are held in the federal courthouse here in Omaha, which is about between 17th and 18th, Dodge to Douglas. And they're done on the main floor of that building. You have to go through security, but there are a number of them that are held several times a month.
I see.
They're conducted by a panel trustee. When you file your case as a Chapter 7, I think there's currently 3 Chapter 7 trustees will be assigned to it. And he'll get these 341 first meeting days, and there will be probably 5 to 10 cases every half hour that will be called up.
Wow.
And they're called up to a table. The trustee puts you under oath. He asks you some questions about your bankruptcy schedules. Are they true and accurate? He might ask you, do you expect to receive an inheritance? Because under certain circumstances, if you get an inheritance in the next 6 months, that would come into your estate and be subject to your creditor's claims. He might ask you if you've transferred any real estate. Occasionally, creditors can also show up. You used to see it more often. They would ask, for example, a furniture store might ask, are you going to reaffirm your debt here? Because you owe us $7,000.
Sure.
And, but that's not real common anymore. But those first meetings go for, like I said, you're probably up there for 5 to 10 minutes.
Oh.
And if it's a couple, only one of you usually testifies, but both of you have to be there. And then after that, people are allowed to file their proofs of claim. And then usually about 69 days down the road, you'll receive in the paper or in the mail your discharge notice. And what that means is that all of the debts that you listed, unless they're specifically declared non-dischargeable, are discharged. They're gone.
Oh.
So you no longer owe those debts. So if you listed those debts and they're unsecured debts, they go away. And you never have to worry about them again.
That's kind of nice, and I noticed that you did mention 60 to 90 days after you've had your first meeting with the federal courthouse. Approximately how long, on average, does it take if I come to you to file a bankruptcy? How long before we've met and we have that hearing?
Once we get the schedules and statement of affairs and the filing fee put together, it's generally going to be 30 to 45 days before your first meeting of creditors.
So then you've discharged some of that. What types of things would they not discharge?
Certain kinds of taxes are non-dischargeable. Certain kinds of intentional damages. For example, if you went out and assaulted somebody and you were found to have done that with criminal intent, that might not be dischargeable. I had a case years ago. They've since amended Chapter 13, but I had a gentleman who had been convicted of bank robbery and spent time in a very, very highly restricted prison, and we were able to discharge it. And they changed the Chapter 13 law. We were able to discharge the monetary damage that he caused as to this institution that was robbed. And it was Donnybrook, but they changed that because they recognize that those kinds of debts probably it's against public policy to let them be discharged.
So I'm discharged. What does my credit look like coming out of there?
You know, it's funny. It'll stay on your credit records, I believe it's for 10 years, and it will hurt you to some extent. But what's interesting is, it doesn't make any sense to me, a lot of times you'll start getting credit card offers, you as a debtor, because a lot of these credit card offers look at those records, and they know you can't file again for basically 8 years.
Oh, perfect.
So they'll give you a new card, and they know that you can't do it to them again for 8 years. And what's crazy also is you'll see people that have filed bankruptcy. I've seen them on their 4th bankruptcy.
Wow.
And they just don't seem to learn what they're doing. But it will hurt your credit. But your credit usually by that point is pretty bad anyway. If you're behind on your debts, on your credit cards, that's not going to be helpful to your credit score.
Correct. So I know that there are some kind of cards out there that report monthly, and some kind of cards that report they have a little more of a grace period, maybe 60 days. And on your house payment, you know, how long do they wait if you're not making your house payment before they start reporting that? Not just talking to you about it, but reporting it. Is there an average?
You know, I do a little bit of consumer law, but mainly on the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act side, not that on the Fair Credit Reporting. I think it's like 30, 60 days is my recollection. It's not very long. And there's some strict federal regulations on how that all is handled with credit reporting agencies.
I think you see the guy out taking the picture of your house, you kind of know what's happening, don't you?
Yeah, you do. And I think people know before that arrives.
You should know.
Yeah.
With these very low interest rates that we have right now, buying your own home, the first-time owner, is a great, great idea because it's like free money at 3%. However, are people getting in a little over their heads on these?
I saw some. I remember I was astounded back when the subprime mortgage came out. I remember reading an article in the USA Today that somebody out in Northern California was buying a $600,000 home with a $65,000 salary. And I'm going, how does that work?
Yeah.
And I knew that was not going to work. But what I see more of is not so much real estate over where people stretch themselves too far. It's credit cards. And people that you would think would know better. I had some people that were 2 college professors who both were making, you know, good money, good income. Then they had $400,000 in credit card debt. Wow. You know, again, what are you thinking? I mean, It's just, but people like to spend and people like to acquire.
They like to have things. I know my credit cards were pretty substantial because I use them for business purchases. And I just called the companies and said, I want this one at $2,000, I want this one at $4,000, and don't allow it to go over, just shut it off. And they'll do that. It's not a hard thing to do, you just have to do it.
Yeah, but the opposite tends to be true. They tend to, if you're spending, and I spend I used to travel a great deal.
Sure.
I used to travel 3-4 days a week. And so I'd have a significant travel expenses on my credit cards as well. And you get up to a $10,000 level, and then they'd increase it. They'd kick it up to $35,000.
Right.
And I guess that's fine if you're managing it and staying on top of it. But I find way too many people are abusing their credit cards.
Well, that's what they do. They start you with $200, and then it's $1,000, and then it's $3,500, and all of a sudden it's $15,000. It's like, no, I don't need that much. And it's because your credit's based on the ability to charge, not the charge itself.
If you find yourself paying only the minimums, that's a bad sign.
You're in trouble.
Generally, what I try to do, it doesn't always happen, is pay it off in full each month.
Sure.
I mean, I like the airline miles, I like all that too, but what you don't want to do is get yourself into a position where you've got a significant amount of debt that's paying somewhere between 18 and 30%.
Wow.
I mean, that's hard to keep up with that.
Let's talk about in the agricultural industry, how do they handle a bankruptcy? Is it any different?
I had a discussion about that back in the day. I was out at a seminar in Washington, D.C., and I was talking to them about representing creditors and debtors in ag bankruptcies. And I said, it's just different. And they said, no, why is it different? I said, farmers and ranchers have an attachment to the land. It's a personal thing.
Yes, it is.
And they said, well, why would that be any different than a guy that owns a shoe store? And I said, I don't know, but it is. Especially if that land has been in your family for generations.
Right.
And then there's, I think, working on the land. That's a different experience than selling widgets. I mean,
Sure.
I just think ag lending has always been a little more difficult. And the problem is we go through these phases where we think that things are rosy now. And for the longest time, ag land prices have been increasing, or they were increasing. And so people felt like they could borrow more money. Well, what goes up comes down. And,
Absolutely.
Commodity prices have been affected by a lot of things, and now we've got the trade wars with China and France. And so you got to be very wary of that. I think sometimes ag lenders tend to think we've got this all covered, and I think ag lending is it's a trickier task than some of the others.
So do you suggest buying a business with a business broker, and walk me through the diligence on something like that?
It's interesting. I'm involved in a case right now where my clients bought a business through a business broker. Turned out the financials were way off base, and we currently have a lawsuit. They paid a lot of money for the business, and they also incurred $1 million worth of debt.
Oh, perfect.
Yes, so now we're trying to get that deal set aside and get our money back. My experience with business brokers, it varies. I do my real due diligence with them, and I wouldn't assume that they're any more savvy than you are. If I were going to buy a business, I'd get my professionals, my accountants, in there to look at everything and make sure the numbers make sense. Have a lawyer to help you prepare the acquisition documents, and just assume that anything that can go wrong will go wrong.
Sure. Yeah, because we've done some of those large liquidations as well. And my recommendation is always, who is your accountant? Who is your attorney? They all need to be working together, and somebody has to look. They assumed that debt. Somebody has to look and see if that debt's out there. We did one where they bought a business, and the equipment that was in the business was on a lien to a different bank. So we really need to be, as buyers, we need to be as savvy as possible to get as much information out there and know what we're walking into, because if it may be a $6 million business at the time it's offered, it may have other things in there that need to be satisfied by that $6 million that you're not aware of. And are you really getting all the equipment?
You need to do a thorough lien search and have your professional do it. You're right, because particularly where a business has got more than one lender, things can get very interesting. And
Yeah, to say
interesting
the
is not
least.
what you want when you're buying a business.
No, you want to go in and open the doors and say, woohoo, big party, we're open.
Yep.
Come on in. And we do see a lot of that, and we see different things that have happened, or someone has someone come in and manage, and it maybe is not your management style, or do you recommend that I'll give you $30,000 down and pay you so much a month for the next 5 years? I think there's opportunities for issues to arise there as well.
There are, but if you have a good mergers and acquisition counsel, a lawyer who's been down that road, they know how to build in things where, well, yeah, you keep these people, keep them hooked in for a time period, so that you're not giving them a lot of money and then letting them see them walk away without some chance to recover if there's something that is on the up and up.
So when a business does close, since we're talking about those kind of things, when that business closes, how long before working with an attorney, how long before you can lease a building out again or try to do something with that? Does it dependent on the person that you had the agreement with?
Yeah, it all depends on the particular circumstances, but for example, sometimes you've got environmental concerns. You know, if you've got a gas station or a convenience store, you might have environmental concerns. It's going to depend on, is the property owned outright? Is it subject to a lease? Is the lease assignable? That's why a lot of these bankruptcies in the retail industry get complicated, because somebody's got to come in and analyze which of these leases are good leases and which of them are bad leases. When my client bought the Gordman's operations, that's what they did, was they looked at every one of the leases, and the ones they want, they took, and the ones they didn't want were rejected, and then the bankruptcy debtor dealt with those on a different process.
I see. That makes perfect sense. And I know when the Gordmans went through that, they made a lot of changes just in the small towns that they were in with what was offered in those stores and things like that. So it was a big change across the nation for those.
Well, Stage Stores was, their niche was like towns of 50,000 people or less.
Or less.
And now they've got it reopened here in Omaha. So I don't know if I'm not privy to their thinking, but they seem to have that model where there's certain towns need a place where you can go buy general day-to-day. You know, my wife loves to go shopping at Nordstrom's, so several times a year I'm drugged to Nordstrom's. But she's also said, I wouldn't want to see Nordstrom's here, because then I'd see myself coming and going. Sure. But you need a place in town where you can go buy everything you need on an everyday basis.
Absolutely.
And I know that it was tough when, in Shopko, for example, they closed a lot of locations in small town. And my daughter and her family live in Auburn, Nebraska, and they lost their Shopko. And it means, okay, now we got to drive to Nebraska City.
Right.
But Shopko had to do what they had to do. I mean, sure. If it's sustainable, you keep it. If it's not, you have to get on down the road. Right,
absolutely. So anything else you want to tell us, Doug, that we haven't touched base on today about bankruptcy and some of the basics?
The thing I would tell you is, don't be afraid. If you're in financial trouble, as we talked earlier, don't wait too long. Go get professional help. Do your due diligence. Make sure that the person you're talking to knows what they're doing. They've done it before. And don't be afraid of the stigma. I've had clients that they're afraid that they're going to be shunned or shamed. Well, the fact of the matter is, they don't even print the bankruptcies in the paper anymore.
Oh, I didn't even realize that.
Years ago they did, and I knew people that would read those every day, just like years ago they used to put every police call in the paper in San Antonio for some reason. And some people like reading that stuff, but it's not in the paper anymore. So nobody's going to know that you've gone bankrupt if you're an individual unless
you tell them.
You tell them.
Yeah, right.
So,
well, there are times that you need to just not tell everybody all your business.
Yeah, people don't need to know all your business.
No, they don't. I agree 100%. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to another edition of Beyond the Gavel. Doug Quinn, McGrath North, as always, it is a pleasure to see you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Shane.